In this video, I'll show you 4 new Taba DIYs, including the world's first holographic squishy. Let's get started with these crystal balls. You've probably seen these viral videos that have the caption, "An avocado fell into my Taba," and they show a super satisfying clip of a random object encased inside clear silicone. I've seen those videos with real and fake foods inside, and I personally find the squishy food version more satisfying. So for the first part of this DIY, I'm going to make 2 realistic macarons using only silicone. I got this mold online which has the entire macaron as one piece. Since we're working with a liquid, it's much easier to pour the layers into one mold than trying to make the shells separately and then sandwiching them together. I'm going to start by greasing it well with Vaseline and picking out the colors for the inside. The paler shade is going to be the macaron shells. Start with any type of Tabas silicone, and I'm just using up my leftover bottles. Now measure a good amount of polymer A and add the pigments directly inside. This hack is especially useful if you're making a custom shade with several pigments, since it would be nearly impossible to match the same color a second time. Next, pour out a small batch of part B and add part A into it. I recommend using scales for this because we need to see the exact weights. Part A is going to stay liquid indefinitely, so simply set that aside until you need it again. Mix everything well and pour it into the base of the mold. You want to stop just before it reaches this ridge on the inside, because this is where the filling starts. Another thing I like to do with leftover silicone is to pour it into a very tiny mold. This Catpaw one is my favorite because it requires almost no material to make. I hate wasting Taba silicone, and this is a great way to get some extra squishies out of any project. Now I'm repeating everything with the pink one and leaving these to cure. You can start pouring the next layer once the surface is no longer sticky to touch. This time I'm going with a darker shade of both colors. You can see there's a deep indentation here which shows where the filling meets the macaron shell. So I'm going to pour the second shade right up to this edge. And now I'm mixing the final batch using the liquid part A that we made earlier. It's worth mentioning that after adding part B, it does make the final shade a tiny bit lighter. This is less of an issue with pastel colors, but you might have to adjust for it depending on what you're making. These are now fully cured, and I'm going to pop them out of the molds. They look so realistic and satisfying to press. However, the filling part is a bit lighter than I would like, so I'm going to go back in using some soft pastel dust. I've seen lots of Taba accounts use this method to create more detailed shading. Pastel dust actually sticks a lot better than paint, but it will come off if you wash it. I'm just doing a very simple line of dark green using a thin brush. Now let's move on to these molds. I bought them after a somewhat disastrous experience trying to make round squishies for this video. These were pretty cheap and came in a set with loads of sizes. I'm going to use a transparent Taba gel for the base and fill it about 1/4 of the way up. Once this is cured, it's time to add the macarons. To do so, I'll need this tool, which I'm sure many of you have also seen from viral squishy videos. This is called an elastrator, and it's actually used in veterinary medicine to castrate animals by putting rubber bands over certain body parts. Someone realized that this tool is very useful for stretching squishies, so that's how it ended up in the crafting community. This silicone mold is virtually the same as a squishy cover, so I'm going to open it up and place the macarons inside. Then I'm mixing up a big batch of clear silicone to fill the molds. Bear in mind that spherical shapes contain a lot more volume than you think, so make sure you have enough material before you start. I made 140 grams of silicone here, but even that ended up not being enough. Another problem I encountered was air bubbles. Clear Taba silicone is usually thin enough for the bubbles to rise up by themselves, but I realized that the shape of this mold makes it much harder for the bubbles to dissipate. So you need to stir transparent silicone really slowly to minimize bubble formation. The easiest way to demold this is to get your fingers over the squishy and loosen as much of it as you can from the mold. Then start turning the mold inside out so you're basically pushing it out of the opening. I love how this turned out, despite making a few small mistakes. The first would be the air bubbles, which are kind of noticeable, but not a huge deal if you don't mind them. The second mistake is that I realized I should have placed the macaron upside down. The rounded top of the macaron needs to match up with the rounded dome of the crystal ball. If you look very closely, you can tell that the top part of the macaron is facing the bottom part of the clear ball. This really isn't a big problem, but it's something I would do differently the next time. On the whole, these look really fun and aesthetic. I originally thought about placing a real macaron inside a clear taba for comparison, but I decided to skip this to avoid wasting material. If you crack real food inside a taba, then you have to throw everything away, so you've wasted all that silicone and the food as well. With squishy macarons, you can play with them as often as you like. The next one is a holographic taba. A few years ago, I created a DIY mold with diffraction grating film to make holographic chocolates. I recently discovered a shop that sells ready-made holographic molds, so I had to try it out. This effect looks like magic when you first see it, but it's actually just physics. This is a cross-section of the mold, which contains a pattern made up of tiny ridges. When white light hits the surface, it gets bounced back at different color wavelength, which produces the rainbow effect. With these types of molds, you can basically make something holographic through a purely physical structure. The downside, however, is that the diffraction surface is incredibly fragile, so if anything damages or blocks the grating, then the effect won't be visible. I noticed this right away when I started greasing it with Vaseline. The part of Vaseline looks completely matte and the rainbow has just disappeared. I had a feeling this would happen, so I'm going to wipe it off and just grease the sides of the mold. I'm going to start by using up this batch of squishy gel. I want to try this pigment, which is called chocolate, and I like the idea of trying to make a Taba chocolate bar. However, after a bit of mixing, I don't like the way the color is looking. It feels very translucent, and I'm worried about adding too much pigment in case it doesn't cure. For the next Taba, I'm going to use the newest type of cream silicone, which I made a video about here. This is much denser, so I'm hoping it's better at holding the shape of the diffraction grating. This pigment is from the same company, but it works a lot better than the brown. I only need a few drops to get a perfectly opaque black. The texture this time is extremely thick and it feels almost like frosting. I don't even have to pop any air bubbles because the surface is completely solid. Here we are the next day, and I'm very relieved that the brown Taba has cured at all. It stayed liquid for much longer than normal, and I really don't think I'm going to be using this pigment again. I'm going to demold the brown one first, and right away I can tell that it's still very translucent. It's also really soft, and after pulling the first piece out, I can see right away that there's no rainbow on it. I don't know if it picked up the diffraction pattern at all, but even if it did, the material is so soft that it's not dispersing the light correctly. Now I'm going to demold the black Taba, and this one is very tricky because the mold wasn't fully greased. I'm so anxious about it ripping or that my fingers are destroying the fragile diffraction pattern. But after it came out, I can actually see a faint rainbow going across the surface. I'm so excited because I've tried making holographic squishies many times before, and this is the first time the pattern has successfully transferred over. This effect is even more noticeable if I increase the exposure on the camera. As you can see, the overall texture and color of the Taba makes a huge difference. Admittedly, this one isn't a perfect looking Taba, but it's a great starting point just to know that this is possible. Next is time to make a buff bear squishy. This probably reminds many people of a video I made several years ago, inspired by the Japanese food artist Konal bread. I found this mold online and I think it looks hilarious. With this type of three-dimensional mold, it's important to grease every part of the inside because the complex structure is more prone to ripping. Now I'm going to grab another Taba gel I want to use up. In my original Buff Bear Squishy video, I tried several methods of adding shading, and I'm going to replicate the one that worked best here. I want to start with a creamy condensed milk color, which is basically color matching the milky Hitohara gel that I used. Adding pigment is actually a good way of checking if your Taba silicone is fully mixed. If the color is mostly at the bottom, then it means that both polymers haven't mixed together. So keep stirring in an upwards motion until everything is one single shade. Then pour it into the mold and leave it to cure. I was able to demold this without any problems, and it looks so funny. Just like all tabas, the surface is quite sticky, so this is where pastel dust comes in useful. It has the same effect as flocking powder or cornstarch and will make your squishy less sticky. I'm just picking out 3 shades and scraping off some dust. To create a realistic bread shading, I'm using ochre pastel on all the areas that are round. Imagine the head is a bread bun and the ears are 2 smaller ones. Each of these gets shaded at the very top and fades towards the base. Then I'm using yellow pastel dust to blend the transition area. Make sure there's a tiny bit of creamy white that's still visible at the base. And lastly, I'm dusting the topmost parts with dark brown. This is really not very complex, but it creates a beautifully realistic bread effect. I'm going to use acrylic paint for the eyes and nose to save a bit of time, but if you're making squishies to sell, then I strongly recommend doing this part with Taba gel as well. This is a great example of how you don't need to have a lot of colors to create a complex looking Taba squishy. Last but not least, we have an infinite Catpaw Tab. This is a clear Catpaw squishy filled with more Catpaw squishies. So throughout this video, I've been adding all the leftover silicone to my mini Catpaw mold. A dotting tool is very useful for getting Taba gel into the toe beans. You don't have to be super exact, as the silicone spreads out by itself to fill up the space. Sometimes I like to make more detailed cat paws, and sometimes I just pour the silicone in random layers. The result is always very cute though, and also uses up your leftover material. Now I have all of these demolded, and they look surprisingly edible. I got this Catpaw squishy cover from the same shop that does the silicone pigments, and I'll add the link below if you're interested. Then I'm going to grab my illustrator again. I'm stretching out the opening and adding all the paws inside. This kit came with something called silicone glue, so I'm curious to try that out. The main problem I always have with these squishies is closing the opening. But after applying this, I can immediately tell that it's just super glue. It has the same chemical smell and it dries within seconds. I'm really glad I'm wearing gloves here because you absolutely don't want to get this on your skin. The glue works fine, but it doesn't create a fully airtight seal. I tried turning this into a vacuum squishy with a syringe, but it didn't quite work. However, it's still very cute and pretty satisfying. I really hope you enjoyed this video and maybe learned something new. These tabas use slightly more advanced techniques compared to my previous tutorials, but it's always nice to challenge yourself a bit. I'm Joanna, thank you for watching, and I'll see you soon. Bye!